Good morning, everyone. We're glad you can join us today. The Metropolitan Museum of Manila welcomes all of you from Zoom and Facebook for the third installment of Art Inspires. It is a series of exclusive interviews with artists, curators, scholars, and writers. And these conversations focus on artists' processes and their experiences in reference to their work or a body of works that belong to the museum collection. Today, we have Ernest Concepcion, who will talk about his works and an edition of Invasion of Ona from the museum collection. Ernest will be in conversation with Professor Daki Fernando of the UP College of Fine Arts and Carl Javier, CEO of PumaPodcast and lecturer at the Ateneo Fine Arts Department. And to get started with our program this morning, we would like to invite all of you for a tour of In Full View, a part of the museum collection. This exhibition is, of course, a reference to the visual narrative and documentation of the 45-year-old history of the museum as a cultural institution. The collection of works gathered over time through the generous donations of Met Museum friends and patrons present a veritable narrative to the development of Philippine art in recent years, with works by modern and contemporary artists from the Philippines and abroad. To take us on this virtual tour this morning is our museum's Deputy Director, Alec Abaro. Alec, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Colaiko, and good morning, everyone. I'm Alec, your tour guide for today. So we have an exhibition featuring many of the artworks in the museum collection. Now there's a lot to see here, and for this short and sweet tour, we'll only take a look at a few of these works, but we'll take a very close look at each of them. And remember, art is not only to be looked at, but also talked about. So we encourage everyone to share what's on your mind using the chat or comment section on Facebook. In keeping with today's theme, we'll take a look at a lot of landscapes of encounters and conflict. And of course, look at where these artists drew inspiration from. So when we create, we are inspired by many things. And same goes for artists. We'd like to start by looking at an interior space, since that's where most of us are coming from. So this is a painting entitled Still Life by Romulo Galicano. So there's something that looks different here, wouldn't you agree? So still life is a genre that has been around for centuries. And like many still life artworks in history, it depicts things in a photorealistic way. Let's zoom in. In modern and contemporary paintings, artists experiment with the way things look. And as we can see here, the artist not only played with form, but also how space is represented. There's a normal fruit on the table, but it is surrounded by these slices of mirrors and different patterns that give us this illusion. Parts of things appear and disappear into something. Even the vase with red carnations looks like it's behind, in front of, and within multiple objects. There are even more stacks of patterns behind it, and an empty frame to the right side. But like the mirror that slices everywhere, the frame looks like a portal or an entryway that will lead us somewhere unknown and surreal. And it does look like a surreal collage. Take a look at the shape of this painting. It's irregular, and that amplifies the painting's effect. So it was very intentional on the part of the artist. So even if we call this still life, there's nothing still in this still life. And it's funny that right in the middle of things, the artist gives us one stable object to cling to. It's a rope to help us navigate this strange space. It gives the illusion that though this space is tight, it does feel like it's a lot bigger at first glance. So like Doctor Who's TARDIS, maybe it's bigger on the inside. Let's look at the next artwork. So this next painting is by national artist J. Elizalde Navarro, called The Barong Randa Encounter. So the artist found inspiration in his travels to Bali and Java and mythology. So if you see here, the painting is really colorful. Let's zoom in. But it leans onto the warmer side of color with all the reds and oranges. What is it depicting? So looking at the title, it's called Barong Randa, and it comes from mythology. So Barong is a king of spirits, and Rangda is a demon queen and an incarnation of a legendary witch that wreaked havoc in ancient Java. And barong dance is a style of traditional Balinese and Javanese dance. The dance demonstrates the mythological depiction of animals that have supernatural powers and could protect humans. So we know that this is an encounter. But maybe can we glean from this painting what kind of encounter is it? Is it a friendly encounter, would you say? So barong has different versions. It could be an elephant, a tiger, a pig. How about this one? What do the animals here look like? Kind of reminds us of our legendary bird, Sari Manok, of the Maranao people. And you can see here the artist taking from the occur aesthetic of the Maranao with the curvy linear lines. And by using those forms and shapes, the painting looks more dynamic and it feels like it has a lot of movement because of these curves. And it's easy to see this in an animation form, right? And the dynamic composition certainly makes it look more like a battle. So you can sort of see two sides here battling and maybe even a sword like thing in the middle. There's even a mouth here with things coming out of it. And there are all these spikes like this in the lower corner. So Barong Dance Battle is like a battle between good and evil, wherein the final scene is this ritual mask dance, wherein of course the good side will win and it restores celestial order. So given this painting, which side do you think is good and evil? And at this moment in time, which side do you think is winning? So I leave that question to you and let's go to our next painting. So for this one, we'll actually be taking a look at a print by Phil de la Cruz, and it's called Aftermath. And the most noticeable detail here is this giant bottle with these tubes that lead from the inside to outside. And inside, we see this tree, and it's the only thing with color here. There's a fruit that looks really ripe and lush and inviting because of the red color. Then the tubes that go outside that we see blend with this empty field of what seems to be nothing or burnt crops, maybe. It looks like a plantation, right? Then we see two human beings, and we can barely make out their expression. One is one has his back to us, and the other one has her face or his face obscured. And let's look at their body language. If you try to copy this position, what would you be feeling? Do you think they have energy or sigla, as we say? And if you see, they're the same color as this landscape. And we start to ask questions like, why is this tree in a bottle? Maybe it speaks of our isolation from nature. And if you look at it, this bottle is even on top of this tree stump. And we see here that we are part of nature, but because of the way we built society, it feels like we're separate from it or isolated. But then this print tells us that everything we do to nature, we do to ourselves. And you see that here the desolated landscape reflects the way these human figures are. And look at them, they have the same energy. And we see here it's entitled The Aftermath. But the aftermath of what? Maybe it's the logical conclusion of the way we live today. And maybe it asks us what happened with our relationship with nature. And maybe that kind of questioning will lead us to reflections about what we can see in our future. So let's move into the next room. So we're navigating the space. So here we see another landscape. It's part of the landscape series There and Then by another Filipino artist, Prudencio Lamarosa. It's a very colorful landscape. Unlike the first painting we saw, there's a clear depiction of space here. We can actually see ourselves teleporting into the painting, walking around, maybe even sit on the rock, go to the far off background. The most eye-catching thing about the painting is these colorful rocks. They're gum colors and they actually look like candy. And they even have texture, like the bark of the tree. It's similar. And have you seen a tree that looks like this? It seems to have some sort of stripiness to it. And it's in different shades of black and gray. And the shape of the tree and the form, it looks like it's slanted, that it's about to fall. And one of the branches even sort of hugs the trees. And if you look at the small, tinier branches to it, they look like mini trees. And it kind of reminds me of our suntan flowers, but green. Then if we sit back on the rock, for example, everything looks so whimsical. There's life here, but then at the end of the branch, we sort of see there's a red there, as if it's cut and bleeding. And the tree looks big and old, pero all we see are baby branches. So we ask, where are all the leaves? And also the color of the tree, is it natural? It looks very pale. And let's leave the foreground and go walk towards the distance. There's a patch of grass, but only in this area here. And the rocks look like they're just sitting on white soil. And is soil even white? Maybe this is sand. And there's a mountain right behind it. And then there's this ledge here. And the rest is just an empty landscape. And because of the ledge, we sort of ask ourselves, wait, did this used to be a riverbank, pero natiyo lang, and now there's nothing that flows anymore? So at first glance, we see something whimsical, but the more we look at it, the more we get unsettling questions and observations. And maybe we can even try to eat one of these candy rocks. But suddenly, we are reminded of the knowledge that there's this semi-general rule that colorful things in nature are usually poisonous. And I'm getting more anxious the more I look on this because the tension is building up. And if we go back to the safety of the foreground and look at the tree again, the tree actually looks like an industrial pipe. So the artist here painted the river of his childhood. He grew up in Tagudin in Ilocos Sur, and this is the Amburayan River, the subject of many of his paintings. The whimsical landscape gives you something pleasant to look at, while at the same time critiquing the state of things, something art can effectively do for sure. So the artist tells us that because of the mining and industrial waste, this river that was once so full of life dried up, and we see a shallow riverbed. And do you know the Ilocano folk epic, the Agni Lamang? The hero Lamang, after a major battle, it's stated in the epic that he bathed in the Amburayan River, and his blood and sweat polluted the river so much that their fish died. So this is a site. It's important culturally too, because it appears in our epics. And it gives us information that even then we had an awareness of how our activities gravely affected the environment. So right now, I know the river has been rehabilitated and it's flowing again. For our last painting, actually two paintings by another artist who was from Ilocos Sur. This is by Venancio Igarta, who depicted early Filipino immigrants in California. So like our artist today, Mr. Ernest Concepcion, Igarta also spent a significant time in New York, where he grew his artistic practice. So let's look at the first painting. He showed these manongs, as he called them, as they labored in the agricultural fields. So we see here another landscape. Look at this central figure in the center. Looks like he's looking beyond into the sunset, or maybe sunrise. And the sky is actually a pretty nice yellow, blue, and white color. But then we look at the fields that they're working on. There's something that separates the sky from the foreground. There's this landscape of desolation, what looks like. There's this dark, spiky things. It looks like trees that fell. So even if the central figure, like many Filipinos back then, who looked into the horizon and hoped for a better life, we see that there's something that bars them, and which is true. They did face a lot of exploitation and discrimination when they moved there. And the painting next to it, it reveals more of the emotional turmoil, wouldn't you say? Look at the colors he used, the aura. It reveals more to us their emotional landscape. So there are actually many more in this room reminding us that artists aren't only locked up in their studios. They go out to the world armed with their keen eyes, and many lend their talents to fight for various causes. There's so many ways to look at art and so many artworks left to look at. So at the end of this event, we'll share with you the link to this virtual tour so you too can explore everything at your own time and space. And hopefully, you'll find new inspiration to draw from too. So in this tour, we saw how a couple of artists depicted landscapes, conflict, and turmoil, and we see they're full of inspiration, and their sources are drawn from endless possibilities, our life experiences, the place we grew up in, the things we love and enjoy, and so on. So now we'd like to hear from our featured artist for today. So let me introduce the artist behind the work Invasion of Ona. Ernest Concepcion is a contemporary Filipino artist whose body of works feature experimentation with painting, sculpture, and installation, often combining classical landscapes with stylized caricatures which attempt to tackle the current post-war condition. He received his Bachelor in Fine Arts degree from the UP College of Fine Arts in 1999 and spent several years in New York City, USA, where he participated in a number of artist residencies, including the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council's Workspace program, the Bronx Museum of Arts, the Artist in the Marketplace, among others. He returned to Manila in 2012 and held solo exhibitions in West Gallery and Blank Gallery. He has since participated in solo and group shows both here and abroad, such as in the Lopez Museum and Library, Tin Au Gallery, El Museo del Barrio in the USA, and How House in Taiwan. In 2014, Concepcion held his first solo museum exhibition, The Crux of Things, at the UP Vargas Museum, and was awarded the 13 Artists Award by the Cultural Center of the Philippines in 2015. So without further ado, here is Mr. Ernest Concepcion.
Yeah, so before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you to Tina, to Alec for organizing all of this, to Daniel actually, who started the whole email run, and to Prof. Daki and Carl for being here. It's a great honor to be part of this discussion, and to the rest of the Met team. You guys are awesome. Thanks. I need this actually, to be honest. So yeah, let's talk about the work. Just to introduce myself, I'm Ernest Concepcion. I'm a graduate of the UP College of Fine Arts. I graduated in 1999. And during that time in art school, this was like part of my thesis. I was making like these quotation mark paintings. I've always been interested in activating the space around works. And I was also under the mentorship of Sir Roberto Chabet. So I actually have this tattooed on my arm, just to let you know. But yeah, I've expounded on the on language play. If you guys are ever familiar with Wittgenstein, that was like part of my thesis, that, you know, we kind of quote unquote language, or everything we say is, you know, is kind of relative. You know, the meanings we put out into the world is always different from what people perceive it in the other end, you know. So eventually I started with the wall, and then Alec, if you go back, I quote unquoted the entire College of Fine Arts. You see that in the balloons floating. So basically I made the UP College of Fine Arts under a giant quotation mark. You could see it floating in these giant balloons. So anyway, next. Sorry. And then I started doing video performances of these quotation marks. So I would walk around with one pair of the quotation mark, and the other person would be just like walk around in these spaces. And technically we're, you know, quote unquoting the area or the situation. I was more of a video performance artist actually before I moved to the States during art school. Yeah. So this was an exhibit in the old Odd Manila. It's a really nice space back in UP. And I think at this time I was already kind of like dabbling on conflict, more or less. The exhibition was called White on White. So I figured I'd make a work that's basically white versus white, you know, so it's cowboy versus cowboys. The beginnings of the early line wars, I would have to say. And I only got to realize this when I was looking through my work. Like, oh, I didn't know that maybe I was already kind of like subconsciously working on that conflict-based imagery as we speak. This is, we could go next. And this is the plus equal sign works that I did at CCP, at the Cultural Center of the Philippines back in '99. Again, it's activating the spaces around the work. So basically you could see the paintings before the plus sign, plus this equals that. So it's kind of like making an entirely new, equation, so to speak. This one, years later, fast forward to 2004, this is when I actually moved to the States. I moved into the States in 2002, so 3 years after I graduated. I did the Line War series. And if you notice those speakers, Alec, if you go back, if you notice those speakers on the bottom part of the work, those are actually uh, playing actual sound effects from my own voice. I don't know if you guys have ever done that when you draw. You know, you make like pew, pew, so I recorded myself doing that for like two to 3 hours nonstop. I was just making these sound effects, and it was like blaring in the. As you were looking at the drawing, you'd see my voice actually blaring these explosion sounds. You know, I thought that was fun. So these are actual details of the line wars, as I would call it. As you can see, you know, it's basically anything that's that comes to mind, you know, kites versus wind, bugs versus typewriters, actually based from Naked Lunch. Um, I've drawn friends of mine versus other friends of mine, you know, it's basically anything that's top of my mind. They're very spontaneous. I think when I moved to the States, I was drawn to, pun intended, to go back to drawing because it's something I've never done for so many years. When I was in art school, I wasn't really painting, I was doing more videos. So due to lack of resources, while I was living in New York, I only had Sharpies that I quote unquote borrowed from my workplace. I started making like these sketches and drawings while waiting for the bus, waiting for the train, and they just grew. You know, the series just kind of exploded nonstop. In fact, I was getting like suggestions from friends. Hey, could you draw my grandmother versus this and that? You know, it's really hilarious. And I like it when I post them on the wall. People kind of like figure out which one is fighting who, you know. And a lot of like, there you go. There's sisters, my sister versus me, because I was living with my sister at that time in Englewood, Jersey. So yeah, good times. Stars versus stripes. That's very American. And uh yeah, stars versus planets. It's endless, and there's so much more of them. In fact, I think partly I'm still making them, the actual line wars, like this versus that, although my work has totally changed throughout. I mean, next year is going to be the line wars 20th anniversary, and on 2022, so it's been this long since I've made these series, just very spontaneous drawings. We could probably discuss later who my influences were, what led me into this practice. Drawing for me is a very pure artistic process. You know, it's like the most direct from brain to reality. You know, I mean, you could draw on the sand. You know, yeah, I love it. Obviously, the works have grown bigger. The early ones that you saw were only 9 by 12 inches, and this one kind of like, it just got bigger. Obviously, I think this was the time when I already had my studio at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. So it's just eventual that the work started as small skirmishes, so to speak. I'm using gaming terms here. Small skirmishes and then they've become more, I would suppose, Napoleonic in scale, right? And this is a bigger piece of paper. In fact, this has even gotten bigger and bigger as we go along. Yeah. This is almost 10 feet long, and it's just this massive landscape. This is when I started putting color into the line wars. Before, they were just entirely black and white. And certainly I had like all these colored pencils spread out all over the place. So I started using that, you know. This is another series that I did. It's actually past, present, future, or what it seemed like in the past. I don't know if you could see it in detail, but there's like cavemen, and then present. Present is actually kind of controversial because this was just a few years after 9/11. So if you could actually notice the World Trade Center in the present middle part of the drawing, and the third one, future space, references to 2001 Space Odyssey with those monoliths, obviously, right? Yeah. And then more of these of this process, I started drawing actual landscapes. And these landscapes, by the way, are based from these tacky photos of calendars. You know, I have like these calendars that had like these, you know, really kind of like kitschy landscapes, you know, and then I would draw them. And then after that, I would vandalize, basically, quote unquote, vandalize my own work on top of it and work around the geography, so to speak, of the landscape, you know? Yeah, I make my own story from it. I went back to smaller pieces, and this is actually oil. Oh no, it's acrylic. It's acrylic and enamel ink. I would thin out enamel paint and use it as the actual drawing tool for these acrylic paintings. This one is in oil. I would make like these oil paintings, and I honestly have explored every possible marker, oil base, alcohol base, you know, so I have all these markers in my studio, and I found this one brand that actually works super well on oil paint. It adheres to the oil surface. This one is a larger piece, a 60 inches long, you know. The Key Boys is actually partly inspired from Dragon Ball Z. I was actually watching a lot of Dragon Ball at that time. So you could say that my references were what was happening during that time, you know, in my head or whatever I was watching. Yeah. These were all done in New York, by the way. Just let you know. And like this one, New Jersey Gods, this is actually an art commission piece. One of my original collectors of the Line Wars had me draw this. It's actually a view from his penthouse apartment in Battery Park, and it has an amazing view of Jersey. And the first thing I thought of it was like, oh man, this is like the battleground for Manhattan versus Jersey, you know. And yeah, it's at his place. Ode to Odin, yeah, it's this is actually one of the original. I call them the battlefield landscapes. These series where I would make like these almost romantic landscapes, right? I mean, minus the drawings, you would see them as just these kind of like almost David Friedrich landscapes, very solemn and surreal. And then I would put on the drawings on top I guess, to activate the space as well. And part of it is invading it, you know. But at the same time, I'm conscious. I wouldn't do it randomly. I would be conscious about where to put my figures. If you notice, I'm still kind of conscious about that in the early years. I would work around the terraformation of the land, right? The geography of the land. I would work around it. You know, this is actually another art commission. Apparently, it's for his baby's room. So, what better way to put SpongeBob in it? On the left, as you can see, arts and StarCraft. I was playing StarCraft at that time a lot. So yeah, StarCraft, man, it's still good. And then this one, this one is inspired from my studio in Gowanus, Brooklyn. I still don't know how to pronounce it well, but we always joke around it as Gowanus, Brooklyn. It's by the Gowanus Canal. So during summertime, you would really smell the canal in the studio. So I made the kind of like this painting in homage to that experience, being in that space. Great space, I miss it. These are also smaller works, you know. Again, the oil paint, ink on oil. This is the first one, the first ever of the I'm glad it's in here also, Alec. The Introduction of Sorts is the first ever painting. The landscape that I did for this one is in fact inspired from Bob Ross. And I didn't know what to do with it before. I was actually really frustrated with the painting. I was on the verge of throwing it away. But then my studio mate at that time during my residency was telling me, dude, just trust in your work, man. Why don't you just like, I don't know, work around it. And then I think one drunken evening, I just started drawing on top of it, and that's how it began the process of the vandalism on my own work. So this was the first ever of that series of the ink on oil. Yeah. We now go back to, I went back to paper, works on paper. So when I rented out the studio in Gowanus, Brooklyn, we had like these super tall ceilings, high ceiling studios, like I think it's 20 feet high. So I utilized that making garana, which is also a play on the word guerra na, which is basically, you know, let's make war, guerra na. And but it also sounds very much like a, one of those like old vintage robots back in the day, guerra na. So I made like this, I've started making this narrative already in my head of a deity, of a conflict deity, making my own lore, so to speak. It's just eventual because I like making stories and drawing stories. And this is a huge piece. It's 10 feet high, more or less. And you can see the detail in it. I mean, I would use step ladders just to draw on top of it. Yeah, it's the conflict eater. This is my studio in Gowanus, Brooklyn. We had no windows. And so I would technically just open the door to let some ventilation. But this is the beginning of the Invasion of Ona series, where I would draw on, paint acrylic landscapes. And these landscapes now are all made up now. I mean, I don't have any references anymore. I think I've been like drawing from calendars for too long that I've managed to like, gain a Rolodex of landscape imagery in my head now, just from copying from calendar. So I just started making my own landscapes, which is really liberating, by the way. Yeah. And these made up landscapes created the entire world that I did. This was my first solo exhibition at the Kentler Drawing Space, Kentler International Drawing Space, also called Kids. It's one of the oldest gallery spaces in the south part of Brooklyn, in Red Hook. It's Red Hook, Brooklyn is a kind of like a far place to go to, but it's one of the first galleries there. I was invited over to do this exhibition. It's my first ever solo show in 2008. And as you can see, I've started exploring drawing on acetate. And the reason why I did that, because I wanted to also invade the space. I wanted to invade the actual gallery with my drawings without defame or vandalizing the actual wall, but I would have like these sheets of transparencies with my drawings on them, and I would just literally pin them on the wall around the corners of the gallery, around columns. So as you can see, the drawings have infiltrated from my own work and spilled out, to the actual space, up until to the ceiling. Sometimes it would go around other people's works. Actually, I did that for the Lopez Museum. Yeah, not too long. When was that? Like some years ago. But anyway, so you can see that it's starting to like go around corners, and it would go back to my actual paintings as well. Yeah. It's all about invasion and not exactly subversion, but more just invading a space. I guess probably a reflection of everyone's concern with personal space. But I was like, no, I'm gonna attack. I'm gonna go there. My drawing's gonna go there. I'm gonna go around. So it just makes so much sense that they gave me my own show, so I would literally just attack the entire gallery space, right? Yeah. And this is only like a part of it. Around it, you could, but it's not in the slides, but there's still more works around this actual installation. I actually call this a drawing installation. And this is a detail that's actually just a drawing on acetate on top of colored pencil sketches. Yeah, that's another detail of that. And these are only taped and pinned on the wall, on the works. Yeah. A great deal of it is also inspired from Command and Conquer. I'm pretty sure Carl would know that. From gaming. Gaming is a major element in my work. Yep. Some of it also from old animes, and that's just to show the scale, of the pieces. There I am on the right, looking like a dorky looking fella. Anyway, so this is, when did I did that here. This was here. This is when I actually already flew back, 2014. And yeah. And what I did, yeah, this series and that what the Met Museum currently has is actually part of the it's part of that original drawing installation. But I eventually segregated them, the landscape grid paintings, so I made them their own pieces. So they're all numbered now from, you know, as you can see, Invasion of Ona number 1981, 90, you know, and there's just so now they've become their own work. You know, I kind of like consolidated them into their own little series. Yeah. And I also like the fact that the landscape has been kind of broken apart. I mean, it's already like distorted from the beginning, but the fact that I kind of separated them from each other made them even more like pocket-sized landscapes. But they're not pocket-sized. These are 22 by 30 inches each. So, you know, decent size works on paper. So these are just, check out the details. I love marching armies for some reason. I don't know why. I have a tendency to just like draw marching people for some reason, you know, just marching, walking. I guess it reflects me just walking around New York as well. I walked a lot. It's a good way to save money on the train, right? Just walk or bike. I have a fascination with Bigfoot. We don't have Bigfoot. Maybe we do have Bigfoot here in the Philippines. Who knows? But when I was in the States, I was totally into that, into cryptozoology, right? Yeah. The Line Wars Deluxe is a rebirth of the series. It's a long story, but the original Line Wars, they got lost. A gallery lost the pieces. I'll probably retell the story later on. But so there was a moment, there was a space between where I got really saddened by this fact. For years, I didn't do the Line Wars because I got really kind of just disappointed and just like, you know, I'm gonna move on. And then eventually they had a rebirth. So it's called the Line Wars Deluxe. So the more kind of I actually stopped using pen. This is all like brushes now, because since now I'm painting, I went back to painting. I'm now drawing with an actual brush on ink, dipped in ink, and then, you know, and they're colored too. So let's just say a remaster, right? A remaster of the Line Wars, a rebirth. The Line Wars resurrected, like Diablo 2 resurrected. No, Carl, tama ba? Everything I make nerdy references, I will just like call Carl up that he would know. So yeah, and these are also with acetate works on small pieces. 9 by 12 inches is the original sizes of the original Line Wars back in the day. So 2010, it's almost been kind of like more than roughly 8 years since I've begun the first series, and then 8 years later I did the Line Wars Deluxe, you know. And this was the first of the praying mantis versus priest Line Wars drawing from 2003. And then I expounded on that on 2008 on bigger pieces of paper. This is also a commissioned piece. There's this one fella from New York who was just really fascinated with my depiction of priests versus praying mantids or mantises. I think there's not really no right way of, I don't know the plural for I just call them mantids. And anyway, so these are diptychs, a larger scale, you know. I guess, I don't know, statement. Certainly you can't help but, you know, put religion in here because it's priests versus the praying mantids. But yeah, Cthulhu is definitely in it for sure, you know. Kind of apocalyptic Ragnarok, you know. Yeah, there's a queen mantis with references to Alien. You see in the lower right, as you can see, and the priest desperately trying to fix the church. I mean, I do this spontaneously with no pencil sketch at all. I literally just work on it and then just go around. And it surprises me. I end up laughing to myself every time I draw these things. It cracks me up, you know. The Abyssal Zone is recent, so that's the title of this entire talk. 2020. This was done last year for the Art Fair Philippines 2020, few weeks before the lockdown. So yeah, this is back. I went back to canvas. I did the battlefield landscapes again, sort of like a full circle, because I haven't done that here in the Philippines yet. The actual battlefield landscape series. So I started doing this on canvas, just just for the heck of it, because why not? I haven't done it here yet. And this is for Kaida Gallery. I was a solo artist for their vernissage for Art Fair 2020. This is Prospect Park, an homage to Prospect Park, Brooklyn, the bandshell where I used to watch. Right, Mark? Mark in chat, I could see. Yeah, where I watch all the awesome bands during summer. Scheherazade is a well-known folklore figure who's known for, I think part of the Arabian Nights story. So it's really an homage to narratives and epic tales, But to be honest, I prefer the viewers to make their own stories from looking at it. I want them to make their own narrative thread, so to speak, and try to connect them. Oh, this is that happening here, and that's always what always like that aspect. This is Streets of Rage. I did that during the Hong Kong when Hong Kong was undergoing this terrible time, the Hong Kong protests. So yeah, this is at that time when I was working on it on 2019, something like that, end of 2019. So it's just a kind of like a blank Hong Kong scenery, but protests, on the bottom part, but also versus ants. I don't know. I mean, I have a fascination with ants, so I thought ants would be part of the protest. And yeah, here's like some of the other pieces for that series. Trapper Keeper is a homage to the 80s Trapper Keeper, right? Have you guys had your own Trapper Keeper back in the day? This was I'm just showcasing here my studio in Gowanus. This is another side of it. It's not a huge space, but it's decent. I've made like giant 6 foot tall paintings in that space lying down. And this is my residency in Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. This was at 120 Broadway. One of the first studios of LMCC was at World Trade Center. So they had to move that space. As you can see, this was 2005. So it's just a few years after 9/11. They had to move the residency to a different building because of that. One artist actually tragically died during the attack, sadly, but that was a great residency. This was when I was invited for the Queens Museum to basically they asked me to infiltrate the existing exhibition happening at that time. So whenever there was like a blank wall in the exhibition at the Queens Museum, I would just go there with my paint and markers, and I would literally just draw on the walls, kind of like a legal graffiti artist, playing by the rules, so to speak. This was during my solo show at Kentler back in 2008. 2009, I had a solo show at and it's called NY Studio, which closed down, sadly. This was in the Lower East Side. As you can see, that's one of the pieces there. Invasion of Ona's right there in the corner. Great show. It happened during summer. This was actually in Rockland Center for the Arts, is in Nyack. Is it? Wait a minute. No, wait, it's in Rockland. I think it's in upstate New York, if I'm not mistaken. So I had to take the train up. So the Rockland Center for the Arts invited me over for again to make that battle. As you can see, I always bring Guarana with me, and then I work around it. Guarana and the other long 10-foot long drawing piece on the left, and then I would work around that. This was in LA. I was invited in my first ever show in California, first solo show. So on the other side of the states, I flew there and brought over my black and white paintings on paper. They're acrylic. That's a whole different discussion. I made like these historical references from World War II, but I would make my own narratives from it. This was it, Bliss on Bliss Projects, which is held by, owned by Jed Merino. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Jed. I think he's represented by the Drawing Room, Tina. But anyway, Jed is also an active artist here locally, but he's actually based more in Queens, New York. He has his own space there. Tolonges is a reference to an old Pinoy comedy movie. What's his name? George Javier, the comedian. He's great. I used to watch him when I was a kid. I think he has a movie called Tolonges, but I made it Tolonges because my friends used to call me Egg Nest. So it's kind of like a reference to that. And so I made my own kind of like cowboy movie. That the comedy movie is actually Western. You know, it's a Western, but based here in the Philippines. So this is my current studio right now, as you can see here right behind me. That's where the photo is taken. My early work, 1983, right? I guess I'm already like drawing subconsciously the line wars. Isn't that weird? My mom kept this drawing. July 28th, 1983. Look at that. So I guess, and then when I saw this drawing, I was like, oh my God, it's like the line wars years ago. And I'm now working with my friend Russell. He's an old friend of mine from back in grade school, which I'm still we're working together right now on a graphic novel. I'm sure Russell is here. He's probably watching right now. How about that, Russ? So these are all done on paper, but I've recently gone to digital when I was doing this graphic novel. He wrote the story, so he would send me the script and I would make the panels and stuff like that. It's called Mother Node. It's a long story. So let's see when we'll see when it finishes. I don't know, but I'm still working on it. We both are. Russell is busy. He's a doctor. Doctors are busy. But he would send me the script and then I would literally just work around it. This is for the recent show. Is it the tricentennial of the Battle of Mactan, the Lapu-Lapu and Magellan battle? So again, I went back full circle to the original Garana style of works on paper, As you can see, LL3000, they summoned a giant space entity called LL3000, which is the space god Lapu-Lapu from a different universe. So I literally just made my own lore from that historical reference. Yeah, curated by Patrick Flores. I actually asked Patrick, is it okay if I make my own story? I was like, dude, just do whatever. That's the whole point. Okay, I'll make my own battle. This is the recent event of the, I guess, bordering political, right? The police shootout here in McDonald's by Ever Gotesco, which is not too far from me. So it's really a reference to that, the cops versus cops. Yeah. Also this year, yeah, I'm just going back to my original process of working, just to have a closure, because I did it in New York and now I'm back here in the Philippines. I just wanted to make that closure, so it's a circle, and then I could move on from it, because I'm doing totally different things now. It won't be shown here at this point, but yeah. I've also dabbled with textured paintings, but that's a whole different discussion. I have a whole different series of thick impasto textured work. And here we are. I think this is the one of the most recent at this point, like only like a few months ago. In fact, I think it's still being exhibited right now. I'm not sure, at Isabel Gallery in BGC. So kind of like not exactly a diptych, but they're kind of related. It's an homage to Garana, the original Garana that I did, the tall one. So it's not Garana just like lying down, and Garana just sitting down. He's a cool guy. He's very chill, you know. That's all he does. He eats conflict. He eats drama. That's what he does, you know. Is this the final images?
Yeah.
Is it?
Thank you,
Oh.
Sir Ernest. Yes, this is the last slide.
Oh,
So
wow.
thank you, Ernest, for that presentation and for sharing with us your sources of inspiration.
You're
Part of
welcome.
the exhibition of ONA installation is a bequest of Mr. Fred Haurilu from Canada to the Metropolitan Museum. Now, I'd like to introduce our two guest speakers for today. Daki Fernando is an associate professor and chairperson of the Department of Theory of the College of Fine Arts, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He mentors graduate students to always look at art practice as a perspective beyond style and technique. Outside the academe, he works as an art consultant for interior design projects and art valuation. Carl Javier is the CEO of PumaPodcast, a lecturer at the Ateneo Fine Arts Department, and a writer whose work has been used in books, television, and film. He was the managing director of Anino Comics, co-owner of the indie bookstore Uno Morato, founding member of the indie publisher The Youth and Beauty Brigade, and the BLX Small Press Expo. He was also Deputy Director for Marketing of the UP Press and the Business Manager of UST Publishing House. So today, Daki Fernando and Carl Javier will share with us their perspectives on Ernest Concepcion's practice. We'd like to bring in their backgrounds on art history and theory with Professor Daki Fernando, as well as comics, geek culture media, and popular culture with Mr. Carl Javier. Daki and Carl, it's great to have you this morning.
Ernest presented a very, very interesting body of works. When you when I saw initially his body of works, one particular artwork from the past, way back from the Renaissance period, flashed into my mind, and that's the work of Peter Bruegel, The Triumph of Death. And why? Because if you look at the work, if you're familiar with that kind of work, that work painted in 1542. Actually, I teach this course now, Art and Pandemic. That's why I'm very much into this kind of works now. You can see here a work about, about a duality, about a conflict, existential conflict between life and death. And you see here a lot of characters, a lot of stories within the work of art. So it reminds me, of the work of Ernest because of the narrative, and not only that, but also because of some elements to it, like how Ernest painted his landscape in an expansive form or manner or way, but also the narrative that goes to it, the different images that you see. As in this particular work of Bruegel, you see one part. There's a part that there's a story to it. There's another different story from another part of it. So it's like comics. There's there are many stories, but centered, of course, on the conflict about life and death. Now, this duality is for me, as I juxtapose it to the works of of Ernest, is more on his more on Ernest's concern on his existential conflicts, in our present world, through the visual language of the geek culture, by using hybrid art forms on his canvas. His verses, his conflicts that seen his canvas on his canvas speak of probably a dystopian world, a dystopian view about conflicts, about an imperfect world that we have. So this, I go back and close on the Bruegel again. I'm using this. I thought of this work not just because of the narrative of Bruegel, but also because of the use of landscape, which later on, well, earlier you saw from the works of Ernest. Now, Alec, if you could just flash, if you have another image of the work of Ernest. Ernest is gives us this pursues that idea of duality for me, pursues that idea of conflict, wherein he in terms of style, he painted an expansive landscape, right? Just like how the classical painters did it in the past during the Renaissance period. But what is so cruel about Ernest is that he disrupted that expansiveness of landscape by introducing another element, which made of this transparencies. Is that the material there?
Mhm. Yeah,
And then
They're made for silk screen. Yeah, the
yeah, and
transparency. Yeah.
he placed it all over the landscape, which disrupted the very classical rendition of the landscape from the background to the middle ground to the foreground. So the
Yeah.
duality and the conflict, the verses, is not only seen on the images, and that's what I'm trying to point out here, but also on the form itself, the hybridized form that he introduced, and how he disrupted the canons also of art making process. Academically, you do this depth of space, but what he did was he challenged this as part of his possibly his perspective about his art, on which basically about existential conflicts. That's why you have all these verses in all his works. What I'm trying to say here is that how he disrupted this very canonical view of the landscape by introducing another form, which made the landscape very flat, which made the perspective flat. So imagine that the contrast is not seen only on the images, but the way he rendered it on the canvas. So it goes beyond the images, but also on the process of art making and the element, how he disrupted that landscape. And that's just one. And the second one about duality and conflict that he introduced in his artworks beyond the images that we see are the type of materials that he used. He used that. Initially, he mentioned that he would paint on a landscape, right, using acrylic probably or oil, and then he introduced another art form, which is again another art material, which he used the transparency and the ink, which totally negates everything about the material or traditional material like oil or acrylic. So it's just fantastic. It's just a brilliant presentation of the idea of the verses, the idea of his existential conflicts. So that I really like about yeah, it's a very brilliant thing, Ernest. I really
Thank
like
you.
the
Yeah,
body
thanks.
works. And again, I go back. I just want to pull something else again from the Bruegel, the idea of death there, the idea of life. The triumph of death is the title of the work. It's very negative but true. But maybe in the world of Ernest Concepcion now, in his body of works, maybe we see a happy person here, Ernest, talking about his artwork, but he's just so cruel in his work by saying everything is all about conflict and all about all these battles and all about this yeah, basically all this war going what go but I cannot talk more about
Yeah.
the references to popular culture, and that's why Carl is here. So my really point of view is to push further the idea of the duality and how I see it from the perspective of Bruegel in the past, done in the past with this expansive landscape, and how Ernest brought it to contemporary time with his own narrative and pursuing that existential conflict and doing that conflict, using the conflict again by way of pursuing that conflict by way of using the art elements and the basic notion of art making process.
I wonder what Bruegel is going through during that time then.
Yeah, it's well because of pandemic. It's exactly what we're
What's happening right now, no? Yeah.
yeah, because was part of the I don't know. I think this is like the third
Is
wave.
this the Black Plague?
Yeah, the Black
15,
Plague,
yeah.
the bubonic plague from the 1300s. So I teach this in UP now, the art and pandemic. That's
It's
why
a great piece,
one
yeah.
of the work that I always
Look at
show
that.
my students. And this is a visually
Fantastic.
arresting work. This is the product
Mhm.
It's
now.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about death that we are all confronted by this. Whether you're
Yeah.
rich or you're poor, power or no power, there's death.
Right.
Anyway, I think my 5 minutes is up, Alec, right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. I agree. I primarily see Sir Ernest's artworks as landscapes of encounter. And there's a tendency of, or even inevitability of encounters to have conflict. And now I'd like to hear from Mr. Carl Javier.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to make this about myself because I might as well as a jumping point of my experience of Ernest's work. And the first contact was actually the email from the Met and asking me to come and speak. And my reply to them was, are you sure you want to be talking to me? Because I'm not a fine arts person, and in our first meeting, Prof. Daki started mentioning artists that I haven't heard of and art theory that I don't understand. And I felt like I don't know if this is what I'm supposed to do. But then Ernest just kept dropping nonstop references, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one. And I see that, and I see that. So, and so
Yeah.
so I moved from that position of I don't know because um, I feel like I'm coming from a perspective of having enough of a humanities background to appreciate art, but not exactly being comfortable in a fine arts space. And so I started to find my connections as we had our meetings and as I kept looking at the work. And so I'm going to ask for two images to show, because these became my entry points to finally figuring out how I would be able to approach it. And the first is this one, which is if anybody watched Loki, I'm sure a lot of us did. This is a screenshot of one of the scenes from the TV show that just came out, I think last month, a couple months ago. And I was watching it, and I said, well, this is the kind of imagination space in that Ernest is working in, and which brings us to the next image, which is Jack Kirby, and they like this. Uh, it very clearly feels in the same spirit as Gerana and yung Shahrazad 2, those kinds of sizes. And when I said it feels like Jack Kirby, Ernest says yes. And then at some point with his newer work, I said Sienkiewicz, and he said yes. So while I am lost in the other references, I get a sense of this, and I get a sense of scale and size. And I feel like someone mentioned in the comment section earlier, it feels like pop art. And what I have been feeling is that Ernest is breaking down these barriers and expectations of how we view what a gallery exhibit should look, and he's bringing in these story elements that are different. And I know that painting has always had a narrative feature to it, but there's a quality of Ernest's work that brings in the narrative storytelling opportunities of comics, even though he's not using text, because there is silent comics, and there is the layout, and there's the way that the image falls on the page. And I think Prof. Daki and I are talking about the same things in terms of conflict and movement, but we're talking from different perspectives, especially for mine as like a comics person that's looking at the Z and the way that the eye tracks and what you're looking at in terms of the details. And I love that basically Ernest is taking his fine arts training and incorporating his love of all things pop culture, from video games to comics to toys. I think like I have a very strong feeling of like mech robots in a lot of this stuff, and just kind of like being a kid making things fight. And so on the other side of it, I'd introduce like what comics has been doing in the last 10 years as well, which is the next slide. This is from a comic book by David Aja, and it's a very clear reference, no? And so comics is not shy about borrowing. Comics is taking and it's doing these kinds of things, and it's like the reverse process where Ernest is also taking from comics and implementing in his own art. And then I'll just bring in the last piece because it speaks to what Prof. Daki was talking about in terms of breaking the way that the landscape looks. And this is a comics page where you see that even the way that the panels fall is breaking the way that we're meant to read it. Because it's attempting to make us view the movement of the character following the eye tracking techniques. And I feel like that's what this newer work that Ernest is doing, the most recent stuff, where he's attempting to create spaces within the piece and moving us across the piece as there is conflict. And well, this obviously because it's still a comic book, so it still needs that resolution at the end of page. But I feel like there's a clear there's a spiritual overlap in these. And so I'm very excited by the work. I think that the thing that I miss out on is the opportunity to be in front of it, because I feel like the epic scale of these things, like when I pick up a comic book and I open up the centerfold and I see, the way that a double page spread looks, and I say, wouldn't it be amazing if this was blown up? And I have the exact same feeling na, wouldn't it be amazing if I could be in a museum looking at Ernest's work? So I think that's my 5 minutes.
Oh, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Carl and Professor Daki. So we'd also like to begin our discussion with the audience. So send in your questions, comments in the Zoom chat box or the Facebook Live comment section. So we'll try to go over and answer as much as we can. But to begin, I know Professor Daki has a question for Ernest.
Yeah. Ernest, when Alec mentioned about my brief bio, I always, ask my students or tell my students that, art making is always seen as a perspective. It goes beyond art production. Art goes beyond just style and technique. It's always comes from a perspective. So I just want, although I was happy to learn earlier from your talk that during college days you were already doing with Wittgenstein
Yeah.
theory of language. So
Oh yeah.
I have I was impressed already that you know your perspective. The fact that you were able to come from this particular framework, a Wittgenstein framework in your body of works in the past. So maybe now with your body of works on versus, on the polarities, on dualities, what basically, what's your framework in terms of how you create or you make this form of art? Because I think it's not just about the style and the technique and the images, but on a scale, what goes inside your mind in creating this work?
It's hard. It's a really good question. I've been pondering about this since you've asked me during our initial meetings. But when I'm in the process of working on these pieces, I rarely think about the actual purpose or reason why I'm working on it. It seems to just happen afterwards. Now, maybe this, I guess that's just how I work. I don't know how some people do, but certainly when I started the Line Wars, it was more of like a personal thing, because when I straight from the Wittgenstein era of what I was doing, the giant video installation work that I was working on back in art school, and then I did all these like CCP exhibitions. Now none of them were drawings or paintings. So when I moved to the States, it was more of like I started unlearning the stuff that I actually learned in school. I think I read it somewhere. I forget who said that I'm not sure if it's Paul Klee or whatever, but art making is all about learning, unlearning, relearning. It's an endless loop of rebirth and destruction, diba? And then I say it all the time. Like I keep making solutions to problems I've made for myself, and then it's just an endless loop of like, and I think that's my motivational tool for just being stuck in the studio, just keep working, because I keep making problems and I keep making solutions for it. But anyway, to go back to your question, it was just an innate desire for me to just like not exactly relinquish, but just unlearn the stuff that I learned from, just set them aside muna, the whole conceptual background or my whole the like Chabet era of my work, and then just go back to just being a kid again. I don't know. So it was just it was super personal. When I was living with my sister in Englewood, Jersey, all I ever saw when I would go out to the library, I actually go to the library every day because at that time I was totally unemployed. This was like a year after 9/11, and I just spent my time going to the library and read books or borrow VHS and watch movies. But anyway, all I ever saw was just like squirrels and ants for some reason. I don't know. This is Jersey, man. So I guess there's more squirrels. And for some reason, I started thinking about why did I just, I need to get back to drawing, but I don't know what. Sometimes it's that's the hardest thing. No, if you have just like a blank piece of paper, like what do I start drawing? I mean, I was a video artist, so dude, squirrels. I just started doodling squirrels versus ants. It was the first ever drawing in the line wars. It was the birth of the line wars, that one. And from there on, it just grew for some reason. And only then, Daki, did I actually started going back to like I have a Bosch a book, you know, and I have like all I just and Durer. I think I mentioned Albrecht Durer as one of my influences as well. So I just went back to like studying again, you know, and because I already did the practice, and I kind of like want to connect that. It's probably also a part of being a student of fine arts for sure, that we have that theoretical background, and that's what makes it. We're not just I personally myself, I'm just not working. Eventually I want to also find the reason why I'm working on this and how I could expound on it. So what goes on in my head, it's really difficult to say at this point, and even more difficult when I'm actually in the process of working on it. But certainly it's part of my unlearning process at that time. And eventually I'm starting to relearn it, you know. And when it comes to duality, certainly I would say I've always thought conflict is a catalyst for everything. You know, I think, you know, right? What makes a good story? You put conflict in it, right? I mean, that's just what it is. I'm pretty sure Carl would understand with all these comic book writers. I attended a script writing workshop back in the day at Mobile Fund, and one of the professors there was telling, you want to make a good story, put conflict in it. That's what makes people get into the whole thing. And then if you think about it, there's conflict in everything. It's the friction of our pen on paper. It's the reason why we're gravity, and you know how we're here. It's the catalyst for all things. And I just kind of focused on that. You know, I would say probably the initial line works were kind of too direct, medyo deliberate, or what do you call this? Literal conflict, because it's like this versus that. But now I'm actually, when you said Daki about my different use of mediums, I was actually also making mediums fight with each other. I'm fighting enamel and oil and acrylic. It's not just the image anymore. It's just me fighting with different surfaces, in a battle with scale, you know. And now currently it's definitely not shown here in the slide show because I don't have actual photos of them yet. I'm slowly deconstructing the line wars now. They're becoming more and more abstracted. I mean, I think that last image that we showed kind of like is the beginnings of it, but it's starting to just, you know, for all I know, I might end up painting like Franz Klein, but Franz Klein with this giant like lines of so, you know, it might just become the line wars might just become like a giant line, you know. Who knows? I don't know. I mean, I'm just going with the flow with this process. I'm just glad that I came from more or less a theoretical background from where I began. And certainly Wittgenstein has been a proponent of my thesis, third and fourth year thesis in during that time. Language play is major in apparently in my work. I only started realizing that when we were talking about depunked aesthetics, because we were talking about, you know, invasion of spaces and all that. So yeah, you know, I've never really looked back to my work till now, till Alex sent me like these images, because I rarely look back. I just kind of like focus on what's ahead. So yeah.
Yeah, just one thing, Alec, because just to, you know, sometimes an artist works and just work and work, and it's by way of looking back, like what Ernest is doing now, that he learns and he becomes more conscious about that kind of framework and perspective, which he clearly articulated now. What he just mentioned about conflict was exactly what I was gonna ask about the perspective, and you nailed it, Ernest, in terms of, you know, finding out what really went into your mind.
Woo,
And
I passed.
that's not because I'm a teacher in UP, but you know, that's
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
want to go out from artists. It's not
Right.
always that they have a framework or perspective before they paint, because sometimes it becomes a stumble block. You know,
Oh yeah.
it becomes a roadblock for the artist to be more spontaneous with the work. And I always tell students that, you know, you sometimes you just look back, just paint and paint and paint, because unconsciously the perspective is there. And see what happened now. You were not as conscious about it when I asked you that question, but now that after answering that question, it just
Absolutely. That's why I really love these dialogues. It's very helpful, especially for all artists. encourage everyone to actually start having like these dialogues, because it's good to like, sometimes we start to like veer off from our actual practice, from our theoretical upbringing, you know. So it's good, you know. I only started thinking about this, Daki, when you asked me that question last week. You know, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Now I have a more conscious effort for my new line wars, you know, the ones that's happening after this, you know. So yeah, it's a
Okay,
nugget of wisdom, you know.
I know
Thank
Alex
you.
gonna kill me if I ask another question. So Alex,
Yeah, we have a question here from Randall Urbano. He says it's great to hear the spectrum of pop art and fine art being fleshed out by Carl Daki as relayed by the history of the practice of Ernest Concepcion. So we would like to ask the artist then, when does an artist become a chronicler of landscape, of real encounters, and the realm of imagination sit? So is there a distinction of the artist as a chronicler and a fact bearer vis-a-vis a future seeker or soothsayer, especially in this time of disinformation and intense conflict? Yeah.
Who's that question for?
It's addressed to you, Sir Ernest.
Oh, for me, okay.
Yeah.
When is the chronicler of the act? What do you mean? Like an actual rep? When does an artist like base the landscapes from reality, and when is it made up? Parang ganun ba or something?
I think also drawing from the distinction of, you know, you're getting all these sources of inspiration. I guess at what point though can you perhaps draw the line wherein you as a speaker of
right
truth and real events, and also as a storyteller of, you know, fictional and fantastical worlds?
I really don't know, you know. I mean, the point, the original series of the landscape, like I mentioned earlier, they were based from actual landscapes that I got from, you know, from calendars, or I have like a really tacky landscape book, and it's just like these landscapes, you know, random landscapes from all around the world, and that's where I base it from. Eventually I grew tired of holding the book while I'm painting, so I just started making my own out of that's as simple as that. Although I'm still, like I said, I couldn't really answer the question, but you can't draw the line, you know, when it's going to happen. It happens naturally, you know.
yeah.
Yes, Mr. Carl, yeah.
Yeah, at the risk of being the annoying person dito, parang hindi yan trabaho ng artist yung mag yung mag-confront ng disinformation. Like so on the day-to-day, I publish basically audio journalism and news reports. And so lagi lang binabato yan. But I think the artistic space, the artist is first beholden to themselves, right? And they're beholden to the truth which they're portraying. And the artist cannot disengage themselves from society. Pero hindi nila trabaho na mag-address ng disinformation. Ang trabaho nila is to attempt to express themselves and their society and whatever they're going through, which is what I think Ernest is doing very effectively, whether it's in this like conceptual, sobrang like self-made lore, or in the Hong Kong piece, which is also just as effective. But if it were up to me as like if I were an editor or curator or something, I would never impose on an artist to say, kailangan may ginagawa kang ganyan. But at the same time, I would always hold artists accountable. Kasi hindi tayo pwede gumawa ng art in a vacuum. Kailangan tinitignan natin yung hinaharap natin. So it's a weird balance, but I believe that each artist needs to contend with that themselves wala tayong ground rules or expectations on an artist.
I would like to add to that also. I think it just happens in its own natural way when an artist starts working in the studio. I've always thought artworks they're archaeological artifacts. You know, I mean, like the Bruegel one is a documentation of what was happening during that time. It certainly reflects the Black Plague in his painting, and I think anything I do at this point, somehow, if you look back in it 20, 30 years later, reflects what's happening in society. That Hong Kong piece wasn't particularly, it's not entitled Hong Kong, but years from now, people look, oh, that's exactly what was happening in Hong Kong, and so similar, But there were no ants, giant ants in Hong Kong, But that's where the artists come into play, to probably change that or something, and it's up to the viewer to kind of like make their own information. And like I said, we quote unquote these things. Kaya nga yun yung thesis ko. That's what happened in Hong Kong, and there were ants in, alam mo yun? So kind of like, it's the language play. I think Wittgenstein was actually trying to say that we're not really supposed to understand each other. Parang ganun. There's just like a disconnect really of what I'm trying to say right now. It's not 100% what you're getting at this point. It's totally, it varies, right? Yeah. So hopefully paintings and artworks, they somehow make it, well, not universal, but to each their own context, right? And it's all legitimate, man,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think Mr. Ernest also is a new, or at least a different kind of socio-political artists. I think I can also.
Oh God, yeah, okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry if you're not
Oh no,
comfortable.
here we
with
go,
it.
ganyan.
Oh, no.
Pumasok na
Yeah,
dito.
I don't really.
Yeah.
But
Kanina StarCraft lang ang usapan.
This is always brought up and on my talk every time, and it becomes like, hindi political. No, hindi nga. It's StarCraft, man.
Yeah. But I guess, sorry, just to add first, before I call on you again, Mr. Daki. So also in geek culture media, video games like Resident Evil that talks about international global politics, or series like, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Through these, fantastical elements, the beyond real or extra real, we artists get to explore real world events and politics too through these art forms, even though it um because the battle between good and evil, it's always like a theme that gets explored time and time and again, especially in fantasy and sci-fi. So I also really see that in your works. Anyway,
Awesome.
Sir Daki, yes.
yeah, I just want to react now. Exactly what Carl mentioned a while ago. Art is very relative. I mean, if an artist creates something, it's based on his experience. Now, if you will ask a person, the artist, should you be a purveyor of truth and disinformation? Mahirap na yan eh. Hindi na tayo pupunta sa labanan na yan. Parang sinasabi ni Carl, nandun na yan sa nanonood at nakikita. It's the role now of the viewer that should be more intelligent and be more critical in understanding these works of art. Because artists, we cannot edit artists, We cannot tell them you should only do truth and you should not do disinformation. You cannot do that, because basically the very essence of art making, is that about your experience, whether it's good or bad, evil or not evil, or if you have another advocacy or intention to mislead the people. Parang mahirap i-chapter yan sa artist, but it's all what matters now is how you as a viewer looks at it, how you as a viewer would be critical in terms of understanding it. And anyway, I just want also to react on Ernest on what Alec mentioned a while ago about sociopolitical. At the end of the day, when you have all these themes on conflict and about the good versus evil, in reality, look at our world now. It's all about the bad and the evil. In fact, I studied the comic. A comic artist in Indonesia, Atong, who did a very fantastic work during the time of a very authoritarian ruler during the time in Indonesia, and he used cartoons. He used comics, no, and the comics was not produced like they didn't sell it, but they just photocopied it and just gave it to everyone. But it's a story about the life in at the time against authoritarianism, and it just mirrored what was happening in society. But if you will just read it as is, it's funny. It's actually very funny. It's just all these characters fighting one another. But in reality, it's about the story of the people at the time. And it goes also with the Philippines, right? During the martial law, when you had Nonoy Marcelo's Ikabod.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I love Ikabod.
And what I'm saying is that whether you like it or not,
That's
Ernest,
true. That's true. Yeah.
into socio-political thing. It's how we interpret also when we talk about the good versus evil.
Oh yeah. I mean, a big influence of mine is Larry Alcala, and Larry Alcala has his own kind of like, you could look if you look at his drawings, it's very social political. It's humorous, but it's certainly showcasing what's going on in the tiny little details of Philippine society, di ba? His major influence.
I think Mr. Carl was raising his hand a while ago. Please go ahead.
Comic book lecture ako, pero sorry guys.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah.
But basically, so si Grant Morrison, no, comics author.
That's awesome.
His thesis is that his book Super Gods says that basically we don't have any more modern mythologies. Parang we look at our older mythologies and they're not relevant to us. And what's overtaken that is our consumption of superhero narratives, where superheroes have become like the global mythology. And so, sorry, this will connect eventually. And so what we're trying to say here is that when people look at those superhero narratives, like Alec mentioned, hindi mo kailangan buhatin yung actual real world conflict, but you're supposed to enter like metaphorical conflicts, and you're supposed to bring out people's humanity. And I think that's what we need to look at when we look at these pieces of art. Kasi kailangan magkaiba yung expectation natin of the artist. Parang should the artist consider themselves socio-political, or should the artist be an artist who is creating in their space, and then tayo bilang readers yung mag-engage at maghahanap. So it's up to the artist to create work that we can engage in, which fulfills these demands for a moral conflict. So ang magaling naman dun sa gawa ni Ernest is sobrang labo-labo lang ng pinaglalaban niya, na you're actually free enough that you can imbue that with any moral conflict that you would like. And so that freedom to be able to bring ourselves into the work is what I think is valuable there.
I agree. And on the everyday level, in our everyday encounters, sometimes we don't see how high the stakes are, like how all these minutiae decisions helps build this or exacerbate the conflict on a much larger scale. So I think what you were mentioning, the metaphorical conflicts that these narratives give us, and how the stakes are always so high in fantasy and sci-fi, it helps us remind ourselves about the stakes of everyday life and connect us better to the world. I would think. Just to go back,
scale siya, like the scale of Ernest's work and the giantness of some of the things. Yun talaga, it forces us to confront humanity, our limitations, etc., etc.
But even the small ones have their own pocket, little battle. You know what's interesting, actually, when I was looking at that installation work of the Line Wars, I mean, they're battles within the small 9 by 12 inches, no? But when you step back, it's just like a giant abstract drawing work. It's like, it's so almost peaceful, Jackson Pollock kind of, and then you zoom in, it's also like just really violent things going on, and it almost, I just thought about this like a few days ago, by the way. So it's all about the relearning aspect. Now, it's probably also reflects on like how we perceive our conflicts in our day-to-day living. We may be undergoing some kind of conflict right now or issues, but when you step back from the bigger picture of our lives, it's just like a tiny little aspect of our, like that little thing that we were arguing about. It's just tiny. Pero if you focus in on the battle, oh my God, so many things happening. It's really like bloody and all that. But you step back from the drama, it's just like a nice little landscape, That's, I don't know. That's what I thought. That's just me, man.
Yeah. Just to go back to the visual elements and going back to the wall, we have a question here. What made you get into the aspects of space so much? So we see most of your artworks are actually on the wall, in 2D, they're wall bound, and you're pushing the 2D space or this wall to its limits. I would just like to ask, what made you get into experimenting with this space, 2D space specifically, so much? And have you ever thought of going into 3D kind of installations?
The first question, why not, right? The second question, certainly. I don't know where this is gonna lead to. 3D or even virtual. If that ano ba ngayon, Carl, yung Oculus pa rin ba? I don't know. I mean, they're still developing the whole 3
Yeah.
VR
Yeah.
goggles, I mean,
Nakahilo pa rin siya.
yeah, maybe not too far from now. Who knows? I mean, I've never dabbled on NFT. I don't know. Let's not even talk about that. I have no idea how that works. Pero certainly that's something I could definitely explore on, actual 3D space, or who knows, right? But I still want to get into sculpture. I still, I'm taking baby steps at this point. One thing I wanted to do, it's not shown here, but I've done sculptures and you'll see it on my website, but I still want to expound the line wars on the sculptural level. I'm still kind of like traditional, we'll get into that years from now. I don't want to jump too far ahead. I'm taking my time in regards to evolving the line wars. I mean, it's taking me like 20 years at this point, I'm still working on them, So yeah.
I'd like to go back to the imagery of Gerana or Gerana. How do you pronounce it correctly again?
Gerana.
Gerana.
That's just the hipster way of saying it. Pero in Tagalog, say Gerana, di ba? That's how we say it.
Yeah. In Gerana,
or bakbakana or something.
Yeah, there seems to be a duality within this, the design and the monster figure. You designed him to be, a conflict eater. But sometimes when I looked at him, parang I think, is he a friend or a foe? Does he eat my conflict? Because he looks very, menacing.
I'd like to point out, this hasn't been brought up. The eventual battlefield landscape and Garana and some of the other works, and to Carl and Daki, they're actually based on a running narrative subconsciously in my head. I've been trying to work on this graphic novel of my own based on these things, these figures. And Garana is probably one of the deities I just made up for myself. I mean, that's what Kirby did, right, Carl, with the new gods? He started making his own gods and stuff like that. Like you mentioned, we start making our own myths at this point. So they were just like a running story in my head. And Garana is just one of those I thought would be, that's all he does. He would show up during a battle and then he would eat up the war. That's what he does. I even made another character. She's called Saint Invasion. And she just goes around somewhere. It's obviously based on the word Saint Ignatius. Pero Saint Invasion is another deity I've been working on, and I haven't started this graphic novel. It's been so delayed for like so long till my friend Russell got me into comic book making. I have, again, it's analysis paralysis, Daki. I have so many comic books on how to write comic books, how to make comic books. I've read them and I haven't even begun practicing them because it's really, making comics is actually really difficult, man. It's harder than it seems. And I think it's only when during the pandemic, which I thought was actually timely, that Russell came up to me. He has a story about a virus. I thought it was just timely. We started working on that on the height of the middle of 2020. So it just seemed appropriate to start working on it. So it's a detective story. It's a noir cyberpunk type of. But anyway, going back to your question, there was one time I think a class from Brooklyn came over to my exhibition at that gallery, and they were actually talking about the chimera. The chimera monster of Greek myths, right? It's all like different things in it. So that's what there was like this class of kids, and that's what they were talking about. Oh, this is like a great representation of the chimera, blah blah, and that even come up to my head till they mentioned it. So I thought, oh yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, maybe. Does that answer my question, Alec?
Yeah. Just for my next question, so in your works there are landscapes of encounters, which, as we know, they breed not only conflict but also collaboration. So I would like to ask, especially now in we're a more interconnected world through technology. Can you tell us about your experiences in collaborations as well. Did you do any collabs in New York, collaborations here? And then my follow-up question to that, addressed to Prof. Daki. Do you see now, at least for example in the College of Fine Arts, the younger generation of artists, do they tend to collaborate more? Or do you see like a flourishing of collaboration that's happening more nowadays? Then also to Mr. Carl Javier, in things such as comics and geek culture media, a lot of it also has to do with collaboration. Can you bring in as well your perspectives on that? How we create nowadays the practices of many of our artists, especially with the new forms of media and the way our technology is really evolving on a very rapid pace. So Mr. Ernest, can we start with you?
Yeah, I did collaborate. I have a collaborative duo in the States. We're called the Shining Mantis. There's only two of us. I collaborate with another artist. His name is Mike Estabrook. I don't know if you have that video on hand, Alex. So what we do, my collaboration obviously is more about we're attacking each other, but that's all obviously the collab there. I've also collaborated here with Victor Balanon, who's also another local artist here in the Philippines. And currently I'm making new paintings with my girlfriend. She's also an artist. Si Ana Virayo, she does like these paintings and I collaborate with her as well currently. Pero before, to answer your question, Alec, if you could showcase, we would make like these giant epic murals because he's also a drawer and I myself am, and we would draw with chalk, literally, and then just our only rule is we're not allowed to erase each other's drawings. We're just meant to like add on to everyone else's works. So it just grows and grows. It's really interesting to the point you can't even distinguish whose work is whose because of the styles are starting to meld together, Yeah. That's a good question from Dennis Andrew. How do you deal with failed collabs? Yeah, that's a good one.
I guess we'll follow that up. At first, I'd like to go to
I haven't had a failed collab.
Daki.
Okay, in terms of collab, we've kasi now art has become more multidisciplinary, in terms of our approach in teaching now, and among artists, younger students, or young artists, they do collab now with other colleges because art, tiba ang daming forms na ng art. We don't just stick to painting. We just don't stick to sculpture. But dahil multidisciplinary na rin yung approach namin in terms of art materials and the materials that we use, expand na diba? Nag-expand na yan. So in the College of Fine Arts, yes, you see artists, young students working with the scientists from the chemistry department, with artists working with physics majors or physics teachers, because, of all the different art forms that we have now. Iba-iba na dami ng articulation, diba? We're at the stage that, fluid na yung art diba? Wala tayong stickler dati na painting, sculptures. No. It's always multimedia, So the nature of art practice now being parang more on multimedia, that gave that environment, that brought up that environment, that made the environment of collaboration more, not just within art, among artists, but within other disciplines as well. So again, it's not just among artists, but because again of how we see art now being, multi-forms, hybrid art, they now expand outside of the art circle and go to the sciences and go to the other fields, though. Because
to add to that, Daki, in fact, the States, they have like these residencies where scientists and artists are meant to like work together. They're actually being sent to the South Pole. I was supposed to like apply for this one. I forgot what it was called, but you have to submit like medical insurances and stuff like that if ever happens to you in the Antarctic. I had a friend of mine who actually did that, and they were just like sailing in this tugboat through the Antarctica, and I don't know, artists and scientists. I forget what what they have done after that, but there's also a residency at CERN. The CERN, the giant collider. They
Yeah.
have residencies that they would call upon these artists who dabble on the on actual sciences. I think that would be interesting. That's probably what scientists need right now, is actually artists coming in, and maybe certain equations would be solved just because it actually, wait, ito pala yung sagot. They started drawing like science. Oh, you just answered the equation. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe we should do that more here, actually, to have the sciences and engineers work with contemporary art, right?
So jumping now to Mr. Carl.
Yeah, so sa comics, like from personal experience, I can't draw. I can't draw to save my life. Parang so I every single comics work that I've ever done, whether as an author or as an editor, has been working with artists. And what you learn very quickly as a writer is you need to get what you're imagining, and then you need to actually convince, kailangan mo mabola yung artist mo. One, bolahin mo to believe in your story. Na sige, let's work together. And then two, after mo siya nabola to do it, it becomes, how do I effectively communicate the images in my head so that the artist can draw it in that way? And at least from my experience, every artist I've worked with has asked different things. Minsan nagba-Marvel method kami, which is magkakwentuhan kami about the story, and then magbibigay siya ng drawings, and then susulatan ko after. So yun yung para artists with their own storytelling feel. And then may other artists, or there are times when I want to be able to control the story, I will actually storyboard it, na ipapanel out ko, pagbigay ko ng ganon, and then siya yung mag-render in their artistic style. So there's this entire range of how collaboration works. And I think para siyang diba, for people that like si Ernest kind of with his music, parang alam natin yung jamming eh. So yung approach natin sa jamming, gano'n na rin eh. As in, pag nag-iaya yung mga tao, like if I'm working on a film, someone will just say, jam natin yung script. I-jamming lang natin yan. Na parang it's almost the same thing as music, where you get in a room and there's this clear sense of respect of, well, I can't play the drums, but I can play the guitar. So I have to respect your drumming. And we have to find a way for these to work together. And I feel like ganun na in art. And if you go to one day when we can go to gigs again, diba? When you go to a gig, nandun yung photographer, merong music video director dyan at some point, nang makukuha mo rin pag gumawa siya ng pelikula, kayo yung mag-score nun kasi magkakilala na kayo. And so collaboration becomes natural. And then to address the how do you deal with failed collabs, and then you just make the next thing. Diba? Parang you can hold it against that person and never work with them, or intindihin mo ba't nag-fail yung collab nyo. Parang for us in comics, the most common reason that the collaboration fails is you underestimate the amount of work necessary. And that usually happens pag baguhan kayong komikero na hindi nyo naisip na it takes about a day to make a page. Parang ganon. Or meron kayong magaling na arts major, tas ang galing-galing yung mag-drawing, and then ma-realize nyo na pag nagda-drawing siya ng comics, paulit-ulit niya kailangan i-drawing yung same face over and over. And there's a sense of boredom in comics that a lot of artists are very resistant to. Magsasawa sila, hindi pa nila natatapos yung 20 pages. So that's what I say, like, di ba? 8 pages. If the person can tolerate drawing the same character over and over for 8 pages, then maybe they can go 20. Pero wag kayo mag 700-page epic kasi nakakasawa talaga yun.
Right. I agree. So I think improvisation is really a big thing in collaborations, and especially new works nowadays, they get adapted. Comics get adapted to film, to series, and when you do these, very technological, intensive kind of works, you really need an army of artists with you. So just to wrap up the session, I'd like to ask everyone if would you have parting words to the audience about how we now face this conflict-ridden world, and how we can help better navigate our landscapes of encounters through art, through what we enjoy, sharing it with others. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's like a pabaon for our audience.
Well, for me right now, I would just like to prioritize your health, right? Yeah, I mean, priorities muna, you know? I mean, certainly we're stuck here all the time to make as much creative process as much as possible. Pero I think staying healthy and strong is put that in line first among everything else. Just, you know, how can you make art if you're not feeling well, right? So yeah, that's just my, and let it happen naturally. Hopefully certainly this whole pandemic actually taught me so much, you know. This I think I was telling earlier before Latina then, you know, that I actually have exhibitions. I was invited for exhibitions during 2020, 2021. I had to decline them because I thought it's not particularly right to, I don't know, I like to make art, but doesn't mean I don't have an exhibition I'm stopping making work. In fact, this is what I miss, is making art, not because there's an exhibition lined up, just because I'm like just back in the studio. That's how the line wars began. There was no exhibition for that. It was just a natural occurrence. So I wanted to go back to that feeling again, that something was happening on its own. And more things have actually just started sprouting from my work because of this internal, ano ba, conflict again, internal, like, you know, a process happening. I'm studying, relearning my past work. I wanted to evolve them, but I don't want to show works that what look like pre-pandemic. In fact, when I go, hopefully when if things go back to normal, it will be a new rebirth, you know, a kind of like the phoenix of the line wars. Who knows? I have no idea. So I think we're solely lost right now. In fact, this is what I wanted to impart. I'm glad you asked it, Alec. Because I remember, I just want to include this. Before, when I was my first few years in the States, me and my classmate at that time, si Manny Migrino, he's also an artist, but he stayed there longer than he stayed there 2 years prior before I moved in. And then we would hang out at his office and we would actually email Sir Roberto Chabet. We would tell him, hey sir, we feel really lost here in New York. We don't know what to do. Because he's our mentor, you know. I mean, just a few years ago, he was like our thesis advisor. He would give us like, you know, just motivational, whatever, you know. And so this two of us emailing him, you know what Sir Chabet told me? He said, stay lost. That's what he told me. And we were kind of like, we were upset, like, sir, why? Why are you telling me this? And it only dawned on us like being lost in a void is actually helpful. I think it's something that you should be more, you should embrace this being lost, because this is the perfect time to start making and searching for new things. It only dawned on us like afterwards of being lost was actually a good thing. Only then did I actually started pursuing the line wars even more, and then residency started pouring through. I don't know. It's kind of like a mental state there. I mean, not because there's nothing happening. I mean, we're really lost at this point. Pero it's not the end of the world, man. This is, take this time to relish the being in a void, right? And maybe you'll find yourselves in it, a higher being in it, you know, that we've actually disregarded back then. Na meron palang a higher consciousness within us. Sorry for sounding new agey here or anything, but I'm just saying it's certainly a good advice, I think, from him. Rest in peace, Sir Chabet. But yeah, you know, yeah, that's my parting words.
Prof. Daki, we go to you.
Yeah, parang ang hirap ng question na yan. But anyway, ang conflict kasi is it's there's one thing also constant in this world, this conflict, no. We don't
Mhm.
learn anything if there's no conflict. It is because of
That,
conflict that we learn things.
that's true.
And
Yeah.
and as artists, 'di ba, conflict din yun sa sarili mo, whether to use red or blue or white on your canvas. That's
Mhm.
conflict, no? But it's a matter of gusto ko yung sinabi ni Ernest, no? Yung sinabi ni Chabet na continue to get lost, to be lost.
Yeah,
Because it's only through that that you learn. Okay.
that's right.
You know, among
Yeah.
me as an art as an art professor, and I'm also an artist. You know, when I look at artworks, I say, oh, this artist is still very tentative. Ay, napaka-tentative ng artwork niya, no? And artists start being tentative in terms of style, in terms of what they want to be as an artist, in terms of what artworks they want to have. Most of them, they usually start being tentative, and they learn from conflicts. They learn from that getting lost, from being lost in whatever it is that she is or he is in. No? And then eventually, if you find yourself out of that being lost, then you become definitive in terms of your art. No, but we all learn from conflict. So that's a fact of life, and we continue to learn, and it's very liberating when we learn something out of a conflict, diba? So
Yeah.
again, definite tentative yung mga artists because they seem to be in a conflict, but later on you become definitive when you find yourself, whatever it is in your art practice and whatever it is that you want to articulate. That's
Yeah,
it.
it's from pain wherein we validate our existence. From pain, diba? Remember that scene, Carl, sa Blade Runner, diba? So Roy Batty, he was like losing his life. He had to like puncture this nail through his hand, like I'm still alive. Diba? It's so symbolic, and he had to feel that pain to just to like yeah, to make him feel human again, at least for that few seconds, right? So yeah, there you go.
We jump to you, Sir Carl.
Sige. So, I have a hot tip for Ernest and everybody else who was digging the StarCraft and the Command and Conquer references. So, I'm going to relate it to there's an online survey, and para siyang Myers-Briggs, but it spits out to you what kind of video gamer you are. And so this makes me think of my profile is I am obsessed with creative destruction. So I when I play video games, I like to blow things up, but I like to blow things up creatively. I like to find novel ways to mess things up, and I think that that is telling of an approach that we should all take, because lalo na ngayon na parang everything is so messed up, there is a tendency to be less confrontational and to kind of just go along with things because everything is so difficult already. And obviously any kind of confrontation or conflict is uncomfortable. It literally makes us parang even just disagreeing with people raises your stress level, right? That's a scientific truth. Now they've tested people, that they ask people the may two lines, and they say which of these lines is longer, and everyone in the room will say that one line, the wrong line is the longer line, and most people will agree to avoid conflict. And the thing I think that we can gather from Ernest's work is he is unabashedly confronting and presenting us with all kinds of conflict, and he's doing it in a creative way that forces us to reconsider how we look at art, how we look at the medium that he's working, or the various media. And so yun yung thing for me to take away is let's bring that kind of thinking into the way that we look at art and in the way that we create creative destruction.
That's awesome. Yeah,
I agree. So we could have easily
Beautiful.
made the title of this event into the Abyss, which is how we normally call it. But making it, into the abyssal zone makes us realize that the abyss is not only this conceptual thing.
It's an actual place, by the way, Alec. You know that, right? The abyssal, it's that part of the ocean floor.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. But in everyday life, people think of abyss as more of metaphorical and symbolic. But apart from being a real space at the bottom of the sea, which can which also seems as unreal to us as fantastical landscape since we can't access it.
Yeah.
But being it called abyssal zone makes it more grounded in our physical spaces and encounters. And I agree with everyone. That's what art does. Makes things just have more flesh and more real. Not only because they make it tangible, but they give us new registers or new language to use. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone, to all our speakers, and of course our audience for staying this long. It's now lunchtime. And
thank you
for joining the third installment of Art Inspires. So we plan on continuing these collaborations with our speakers today and organize exhibitions and public programs featuring, comics, popular culture, and of course the artworks of Mr. Ernest Concepcion. So send us your thoughts and comments through the evaluation form. We'd love to hear from you, and your feedback will help us do better in our future events as we prepare for the reopening of our new spaces in Bonifacio Global City in the last quarter of 2021. So to those who would like to receive an e-certificate, kindly fill up the evaluation form. And lastly, we invite everyone to like and follow the Met pages for updates on our program offerings and future exhibitions. Thanks again.
Thank you.